The 6th of June, 1918, dawned with an eerie stillness over the wheat fields of northern France, a deceptive calm that would soon shatter into one of the most ferocious battles American forces had ever witnessed. Captain Lloyd Williams of the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, stood at the edge of a forest that the French called Bois de Belleau Wood, watching smoke rise from distant villages as German artillery pounded the landscape into submission. The French colonial troops streaming past his position told a story written in their hollow eyes: retreat, collapse, defeat. A French colonel, his uniform caked with mud and despair, approached Williams with urgent advice to fall back. The American captain's response would echo through Marine Corps history: retreat? Hell, we just got here. This moment crystallized the desperation of the spring of 1918. Germany's massive Ludendorff offensive, launched in March, had driven a bulge 50 miles deep into Allied lines, bringing Kaiser Wilhelm's forces closer to Paris than they had been since 1914. The French capital, just 40 miles from Belleau Wood, braced for invasion. Church bells were silenced, and evacuation plans dusted off from previous crises. Into this cauldron of uncertainty marched the American Expeditionary Forces under General John Pershing, and among them, the 4th Brigade of Marines, men who would earn a nickname that still resonates: Teufelhunden, the Devil Dogs. The Marines arriving at Belleau Wood represented America's answer to years of European slaughter. These were not the tired, shell-shocked veterans of Verdun or the Somme, but fresh troops burning with the idealism of a nation that had finally joined the Great War. Many had never heard a shot fired in anger. They came from farms in Iowa and factories in Pennsylvania, from the streets of New York and the bayous of Louisiana. First Sergeant Daniel Daly, already a 2-time Medal of Honor recipient from previous campaigns in China and Haiti, found himself among them, a grizzled veteran leading boys barely old enough to shave. According to historical accounts documented in multiple military histories, including those preserved by the United States Marine Corps History Division, the tactical situation facing the Marines was dire. German forces held Belleau Wood, a hunting preserve spanning nearly 2 square miles, its ancient oaks and rocky terrain providing natural fortifications. Machine gun nests dotted the forest, their interlocking fields of fire creating a killing ground. The German 461st Imperial Infantry Regiment, battle-hardened from 4 years of warfare, occupied positions they had carefully prepared with barbed wire, trenches, and concrete emplacements. Major General Omar Bundy, commanding the 2nd Infantry Division, which included the Marine Brigade, received orders to halt the German advance at all costs. The 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, took position in the village of Lucy-le-Bocage, while the 3rd Battalion, 6th Marines, held the line at the Champillon sector. Between them stretched open wheat fields, their golden stalks soon to be painted red. The stage was set for a battle that would test American resolve and forge the modern Marine Corps identity in fire and blood. The first major Marine assault began at 1700 hours on the 6th of June, 1918, and immediately descended into chaos. Companies of the 1st Battalion, 6th Marines under Major John Hughes advanced across wheat fields toward the western edge of Belleau Wood in formations that would have been familiar to Napoleon's armies, neat lines of men walking shoulder to shoulder. What they encountered was 20th century warfare at its most brutal. German Maxim machine guns firing 600 rounds per minute from concealed positions. Gunnery Sergeant Ernest Jansen, leading his platoon across the open ground, watched men fall like wheat before a scythe. The distinctive crack of Mauser rifles mixed with the mechanical chatter of machine guns created a symphony of death. Marines dropped by the dozens, some crying out, others falling silently into the grain. Yet still they advanced. Lieutenant Lemuel Shepard, who would decades later become Commandant of the Marine Corps, found himself crawling through wheat stalks slick with the blood of his men, coordinating fire and movement while German artillery shells turned the earth into fountains of dirt and steel fragments. The village of Bourreches, a small cluster of stone houses on Belleau Wood's eastern edge, became a critical objective. Captain Donald Duncan's 96th Company attacked the village at dusk, street fighting room to room against German defenders who contested every wall and cellar. Private Carl Brannan, a 22-year-old from Mississippi, later described the scene in his memoirs: the acrid smell of cordite mixing with the sweet stench of death, the screams of wounded horses from German cavalry units, the constant thunder of artillery that made coherent thought nearly impossible. By nightfall, Bourrechez belonged to the Marines, but at a terrible cost. Half of Duncan's company lay dead or wounded. First Sergeant Daniel Daly achieved legendary status during the assault on Hill 142, a slight rise offering observation over the surrounding terrain. Pinned down by machine gun fire with his platoon frozen in terror, Daly rose from cover and charged forward, shouting words that became Marine Corps lore. "Come on, you sons of bitches, do you want to live forever?" His men followed, storming the German position in a fury of rifle butts and bayonets. The hill was taken, though Daly received wounds that would have sent most men to the rear. He refused evacuation, binding his injuries with field dressings and continuing to fight. The night of the 6th brought no respite. German artillery, including the feared 15-centimeter howitzers, pounded Marine positions with high explosive and gas shells. Men huddled in hastily dug foxholes, their newly issued gas masks providing inadequate protection against the mustard and phosgene agents that drifted across the battlefield like malevolent fog. Hospital corpsmen worked by candlelight in makeshift aid stations, their morphine supplies dwindling as casualties mounted. By dawn on the 7th of June, the Marines had suffered over 1,000 casualties, more losses in a single day than in the entire previous history of the Corps. Yet the Germans had learned a harsh lesson. These Americans would not break. Prisoners taken by Marine patrols told interrogators of their shock at the ferocity of the attacks. These were not the reluctant conscripts they had faced from other Allied armies, worn down by years of attrition. These Marines attacked with a fury that unnerved even veteran German troops, fighting with rifle, bayonet, and bare hands when ammunition ran low. The 7th of June, 1918, revealed Belleau Wood in full daylight horror. A tangled wilderness of ancient hunting grounds transformed into a fortress of death. Major Thomas Holcomb's 2nd Battalion, 6th Marines prepared to assault the wood's southern edge, studying terrain that seemed designed by nature to favor the defender. Massive boulders the size of houses dotted the forest floor, each potentially concealing German machine gun crews. Thick underbrush limited visibility to mere yards. The trees themselves, some centuries old, had been scarred by artillery until their splintered trunks resembled skeletal fingers clawing at the sky. The attack commenced at dawn, and immediately the Marines discovered that conventional tactics meant nothing in this green hell. Companies lost contact with each other within minutes of entering the woods. Compass readings proved worthless, as the forest seemed to swallow all sense of direction. German defenders, many from elite Jaeger units trained in forest warfare, exploited every advantage. They allowed Marine squads to pass their concealed positions, then opened fire from behind, creating pockets of isolated Americans fighting for survival in every direction. 2nd Lieutenant Clifton Cates, commanding the 96th Company's 2nd Platoon, found himself in command of the entire company by mid-morning. Every officer senior to him had been killed or wounded. The 23-year-old from Tennessee, who would later earn 4 Navy Crosses and become the 19th Commandant of the Marine Corps, rallied his surviving men around a cluster of boulders they nicknamed the Castle. For 6 hours they held against repeated German counterattacks, their Springfield rifles growing too hot to touch, their ammunition so depleted that they stripped cartridges from the dead. The confusion of forest combat created moments of surreal intensity. Corporal Thomas Gowans stumbled upon a German aid station while separated from his unit, finding himself face to face with 3 enemy soldiers tending their wounded. The brief firefight in that confined space ended with Gowans the sole survivor, haunted by the memory of dying men speaking in a language he could not understand. Such intimate violence characterized Belleau Wood. This was not the distant, impersonal killing of artillery barrages, but close-quarter slaughter where men saw their enemies' faces. Private First Class Henry Hulbert, a runner for battalion headquarters, made 17 trips through the forest carrying messages between isolated units, each journey a lottery with death. German snipers, many positioned in the tree canopy, picked off Marines with methodical precision. The distinctive crack of their Gewehr 98 rifles sent men diving for cover, knowing that the next shot might carry their name. Hulbert survived, though his uniform was torn by bullet holes and shrapnel, earning him the Navy Cross for his courage under fire. As documented in the official records of the American Expeditionary Forces, the Marines' tenacity began yielding ground by nightfall on the 7th. They held approximately 1/3 of Belleau Wood, a toehold purchased with blood. German forces still controlled the northern 2/3, and their determination to hold seemed unshakable. Captured documents revealed why. German High Command had issued orders that Belleau Wood must be held at all costs as a matter of national prestige. The Americans' unexpected ferocity had become a propaganda problem for a German military establishment that had dismissed the United States as a negligible military power. The night brought more gas attacks, the sickly yellow-green clouds of chlorine mixing with phosgene drifting through the forest like fog. Marines slept in their masks, if they slept at all, knowing that German infiltrators prowled the darkness, seeking isolated positions to overrun. The forest itself seemed to breathe with malevolence, every sound potentially heralding attack. The 8th of June 1918 brought a terrible realization to both sides. Belleau Wood would yield its ground only through methodical, brutal attrition. Major General James Harbord, commanding the 4th Marine Brigade, studied maps that showed a forest divided into a checkerboard of control. Marines holding the southern portions, Germans the north, with contested ground between where patrols from both sides clashed in savage firefights that left no survivors to report what transpired. Artillery now dominated the battlefield in ways the initial assault had not. French 75mm guns, the famous 75, that had saved Paris in 1914, pounded German positions with high-explosive shells. The Germans responded with their own heavy artillery, including the feared 150mm guns that could reduce a Marine position to a crater in seconds. Gunnery Sergeant Fred Stockham led his platoon through this steel hurricane, personally carrying wounded men to safety, while gas attacks rolled across the battlefield. Though wounded himself and partially blinded by gas, Stockham gave his gas mask to a wounded Marine, an act of selflessness that would cost him his life days later and earn him the Medal of Honor. The small village of Lucy-le-Bocage, serving as the Marine headquarters and aid station, transformed into a vision of hell. Wounded men lay in rows in the streets, their groans creating a chorus of agony that never ceased. Hospital corpsmen worked until they collapsed from exhaustion, performing amputations and emergency surgeries with instruments sterilized in boiling water over open fires. The French civilians who had not evacuated opened their homes and barns to the wounded, elderly women binding wounds and offering what comfort they could to boys who reminded them of sons lost at Verdun or the Marne. Captain Graves Erskine's 51st Company launched another attack into Belleau Wood on the 9th of June, attempting to clear the central sectors. The advance lasted 3 hours and gained 200 yards, every yard purchased with American blood. German machine gun positions, invisible until they opened fire, decimated advancing platoons. Private James Branch, a clerk from Boston who had enlisted seeking adventure, found himself the last man alive in his squad, surrounded by the bodies of men he had trained with, shipped across the Atlantic with, laughed with just hours earlier. He held his position alone until reinforcements arrived, firing his Browning automatic rifle until the barrel glowed red. The psychological toll began manifesting in ways that terrified unit commanders. Men developed the 1,000-yard stare that veterans of Verdun would recognize. Eyes that looked through rather than at people. Minds retreating from horrors too great to process. Shell shock, as it was then called, began appearing with increasing frequency. Marines who had charged fearlessly into machine gun fire now shook uncontrollably at the sound of distant artillery. Medical officers, untrained in psychiatric care, could only evacuate the most severe cases, while men barely holding themselves together remained in the line because the Corps needed every rifle. The 10th and 11th of June brought torrential rain, turning Belleau Wood into a quagmire. Foxholes filled with water, forcing men to choose between drowning or exposing themselves to enemy fire. The dead, impossible to recover from contested ground, began to decompose in the heat despite the rain. The stench became another weapon, a psychological assault that reminded every Marine of their potential fate. German and American dead lay sometimes within touching distance, their bodies becoming grotesque landmarks. Go 20 yards past the dead German with the red beard, then turn north toward the boulder where Johnson's body is. Yet the Marines held, refusing to yield ground once taken. This stubbornness, this refusal to accept defeat, began to shift the battle's momentum in imperceptible but crucial ways. The 12th of June, 1918, marked a turning point not in the battle's outcome, that remained unclear, but in how the world perceived these American Marines. A German intelligence report, captured by French forces and shared with American headquarters, contained a phrase that would define the Corps for generations. The Americans are attacking with extraordinary fury. These are not ordinary troops, but elite devils who fight like hounds from hell. The term Teufelhunden, devil dogs, was born not as propaganda, but as an enemy's grudging respect. Major Maurice Shearer, commanding the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, planned a coordinated assault to finally break German resistance in Belleau Wood's northern section. The attack, scheduled for the 13th of June, would involve 3 companies advancing simultaneously, while French artillery laid down a rolling barrage designed to suppress German machine guns. On paper, the plan was sound. In execution, it became another bloody testament to the forest's refusal to yield. The assault began at 0400 hours, dawn light barely penetrating the forest canopy. Captain Dwight Smith's 43rd Company advanced into a maelstrom of fire. German defenders, warned by the artillery preparation, had withdrawn to secondary positions, then emerged when the barrage lifted to catch the Marines in the open. Smith fell in the first minutes, shot through the chest. First Lieutenant James McBrayer assumed command, leading the survivors forward through sheer force of will. They captured 3 machine gun nests, killing their crews in hand-to-hand fighting that left no room for mercy or prisoners. Sergeant Major John Quick, a Medal of Honor recipient from the Spanish-American War 2 decades earlier, found himself in combat again at age 45. His age, ancient by infantry standards, did not slow him as he moved through Belleau Wood coordinating ammunition resupply to forward positions. German artillery had severed communication lines, so Quick ran messages personally, his gray-streaked hair and lined face contrasting sharply with the baby-faced Marines he supported. His presence steadied young men on the edge of breaking. If this old warrior could face this hell with calmness, perhaps they could as well. The fighting in Belleau Wood had devolved into something primal. Rifles jammed from the mud and blood coating them. Bayonets broke or stuck in bodies and were left behind. Men fought with entrenching tools, sharpened like medieval axes, or simply with rocks and fists. Private James Finnegan, a former boxer from Philadelphia, killed 3 German soldiers in a crater with nothing but his bare hands when his rifle shattered against a tree trunk. He emerged from that hole covered in blood, none of it his own. His knuckles stripped to bone, his eyes empty of everything human. According to historical documentation from the Marine Corps Historical Division, the period between the 13th and 18th of June saw some of the most intense small unit combat in American military history to that date. Individual squads and fire teams fought isolated battles, often without contact with higher command for hours or days. Lieutenant John Thomason, who would later write the definitive Marine account of the battle, described the forest as eating men like a green dragon, swallowing them whole and spitting out only corpses. The French population, watching from their shattered villages, began to see these Americans differently. The polite, somewhat naive young men who had arrived weeks earlier, brimming with enthusiasm and inexperience, had been forged into something harder. French officers, veterans of 4 years of slaughter, began referring to the Marines with respect previously reserved for their own elite units. General Ferdinand Foch, Supreme Allied Commander, visited Marine positions on the 15th of June and emerged visibly moved by what he witnessed. Exhausted men, faces blackened by powder smoke, uniforms in tatters, eyes haunted by horrors, yet still preparing for the next attack. The 15th of June, 1918, dawned with fog so thick that visibility dropped to mere feet, creating an eerie silence across Belleau Wood. This meteorological gift allowed both sides to evacuate wounded, resupply ammunition, and bury at least some of their dead. First Lieutenant Lemuel Shepard used the respite to reorganize his decimated platoon. Of the 42 men he had led into the forest 10 days earlier, 17 remained fit for duty. The survivors, no longer the fresh-faced recruits who had landed in France, had developed the efficient, economical movements of veteran combat soldiers. They cleaned weapons with ritualistic care, knowing their lives depended on a rifle that would fire when needed. Major General Harbord made a crucial decision during this lull. The Marines needed reinforcement and rotation. Elements of the United States Army's 3rd Infantry Division arrived to support the exhausted Marines. Though the Leathernecks initially viewed these soldiers with suspicion, the inter-service rivalry that would characterize American military culture for generations began in these muddy foxholes. Those soldiers and Marines quickly learned mutual respect when the fighting resumed. The Army's 7th Infantry Regiment took over the eastern approaches to Belleau Wood, allowing Marines to concentrate on the forest's stubborn northern section. The German defenders, contrary to optimistic Allied intelligence assessments, remained formidable. The 461st Regiment had been reinforced by elements of the 237th Division, including fresh Sturmabteilung, stormtrooper units trained in the aggressive infiltration tactics that had nearly won Germany the war during the spring offensive. These elite troops launched a counterattack on the 16th of June that briefly recaptured portions of the forest's southern edge. Captain Lloyd Williams's company, the same unit that had declared, "We just got here," found itself fighting desperately to hold ground already paid for in blood. Private John Kelly, a 21-year-old from Chicago, single-handedly stopped the German advance at a critical junction. Armed with a Chauchat automatic rifle, the notoriously unreliable French weapon American forces had been issued, Kelly held a position against an entire German platoon. He fired until the Chauchat jammed, switched to his pistol, fired until that ran dry, then fixed bayonet and charged the Germans alone. The sheer audacity of his attack so stunned the enemy that they fell back, allowing Marine reinforcements to arrive. Kelly survived, earning the Medal of Honor, though he would die of influenza before the war ended, another victim of the pandemic sweeping through military camps. As documented in records from the American Expeditionary Forces headquarters, the battle's character shifted during the 3rd week of June. The initial shock and confusion gave way to methodical, if still brutal, tactics. Marine officers learned to coordinate artillery support more effectively, using French gunners' expertise to suppress German positions before infantry assaulted. Flamethrowers, new and terrifying weapons, arrived at the front. Specialized teams trained to use these devices advanced into contested sections of the forest, burning out machine gun nests in plumes of liquid fire that turned men into living torches. The screams of burning Germans haunted Marines who witnessed these attacks, even as they acknowledged the weapon's effectiveness. The village of Buresh, captured in the battle's early days, became a symbol of Marine tenacity. German artillery pounded the stone houses daily, reducing them to rubble, yet Marines held the ruins. Captain Duncan, wounded 3 times, refused evacuation and continued commanding his company from a cellar that served as both command post and aid station. French civilians, an elderly woman named Madame Tuillier and her teenage daughter, refused to evacuate, instead tending wounded Marines and sharing their meager food supplies. Their courage amid such violence reminded the Americans what they were fighting to defend. The 17th of June brought the first genuine optimism since the battle began. Aerial reconnaissance photographs, taken by French observation planes, showed German forces withdrawing from some positions in Belleau Wood's northern section. The Marine advance, measured in yards per day, had convinced German commanders that holding the entire forest was no longer feasible. They began concentrating their defenses in the northeastern quadrant, preparing for a final stand that would test both armies' resolve to its breaking point. The 21st of June, 1918, arrived with crystalline clarity after days of rain. The sunrise painting Belleau Wood in shades of gold that seemed cruelly beautiful given the forest's bloody reality. Major Shearer assembled his battalion commanders for what everyone understood would be the final assault. The 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines would attack from the south, while the 3rd Battalion, 6th Marines pressed from the west. The 2nd Battalion would remain in reserve, ready to exploit any breakthrough. French artillery, including the powerful 155mm guns, would deliver the heaviest bombardment yet concentrated on the forest's northern section, where German resistance remained strongest. At 0500 hours, the barrage began. For 4 hours, French shells rained on German positions with industrial precision. The ancient trees of Belleau Wood, survivors of centuries of hunting and peace, fell like matchsticks under the bombardment. The earth itself seemed to convulse, fountains of dirt and rock reaching skyward. German survivors later described the experience as hell made manifest, the constant explosions making thought impossible, driving some men insane before the infantry assault even began. When the barrage lifted at 0900 hours, Marines emerged from their positions like wraiths rising from the earth. Lieutenant Clifton Cates, his uniform in tatters, his face aged beyond his 23 years, led his men into what remained of the forest. They encountered resistance immediately, German machine gunners who had survived the bombardment by sheltering in deep dugouts. But something had changed in these final days. The German defenders, though still deadly, no longer possessed the confidence and aggression of the battle's early stages. They were exhausted, isolated, aware that the wider German offensive had stalled and that reinforcement would not come. Gunnery Sergeant Marvin Harris, a tobacco farmer from North Carolina, led his squad in clearing a complex of German positions near the forest's northeastern corner. Room to room, trench to trench, they advanced with the efficiency born of terrible experience. Harris personally killed 7 German soldiers that day, not with the wild fury of earlier assaults, but with the cold professionalism of a man performing a necessary job. His squad suffered no casualties in 6 hours of combat, a testament to how much these Marines had learned since their first, costly attacks 2 weeks earlier. By noon, Marines controlled all but a small pocket in Belleau Wood's far northeastern corner. Major Shearer, studying reports from forward units, made the decision to pause and consolidate rather than risk unnecessary casualties in one final rush. The German position was surrounded, their ammunition and food supplies cut off. Time, for once, favored the Americans. This caution, so different from the headlong charges of early June, reflected how much the Marine Corps had matured in those brutal weeks. Valor remained essential, but now tempered with tactical wisdom purchased through loss. The German commander in the remaining pocket, a Captain von Kleist, requested parley on the afternoon of the 21st. Under a white flag, he met with Captain Keller Rocky of the 2nd Battalion, 6th Marines. Von Kleist's proposal was straightforward. Allow his surviving 70 men to withdraw to German lines with their weapons, and he would surrender the position without further fighting. Rocky, after consulting with Shearer, refused. The Marines had paid too high a price to grant such terms. Von Kleist returned to his men, and the final fight began at dusk. The last German resistance in Belleau Wood ended shortly after 2100 hours on the 21st of June, 1918. Private Edward Gibbons of the 79th Company, 6th Marines, was awarded the distinction of capturing the final German machine gun position, a concrete emplacement that had caused terrible casualties throughout the battle. When Gibbons emerged from the smoke and chaos, he found himself the ranking survivor of his platoon, 12 men from the 38 who had begun the final assault. He sat on the captured machine gun and wept, overcome by exhaustion, relief, and grief for friends who would never see this moment. The 26th of June, 1918, brought the message that made history. Major Shearer sent a runner to brigade headquarters with a simple dispatch that would be immortalized in Marine Corps tradition. Wood's now U.S. Marine Corps entirely. The battle for Belleau Wood, which French commanders had estimated might require 2 days, had consumed 20 days of savage fighting. The cost had been staggering. The 4th Marine Brigade suffered over 5,000 casualties, nearly 50% of its strength, with over 1,000 killed in action. German losses, estimated from captured records and prisoner interrogations, exceeded 10,000 when including those captured or missing. The forest itself had been transformed from a gentleman's hunting preserve into a moonscape. Artillery from both sides had reduced ancient oaks to splintered stumps. The ground, once carpeted with flowers and grass, had been churned into a wasteland of shell craters, unexploded ordnance, and hastily dug graves. French authorities would later estimate that over 100,000 artillery shells had struck Belleau Wood during the battle, an average of nearly 5,000 shells per acre of forest. Walking through it after the fighting ceased, veterans described a silence more disturbing than combat's chaos, broken only by the cries of wounded men yet to be found in the devastation. The dead required weeks to recover and identify. Graves registration teams moved through Belleau Wood with the grim efficiency of industrial workers, cataloging bodies by unit, attempting to match dog tags with remains often rendered unidentifiable by artillery or decomposition. Second Lieutenant William Hamilton, assigned to this duty, wrote in his diary of finding positions where entire squads had died together, their bodies intermingled in death as they had been in life. German and American dead lay side by side in some locations, testament to the intimate violence of forest combat where opposing lines might be separated by mere feet. The French government, in recognition of the Marines' sacrifice, officially renamed Belleau Wood as Bois de la Brigade de Marine, Wood of the Marine Brigade. This honor, unprecedented for a foreign military unit, reflected not just gratitude, but awe at what these Americans had accomplished. French General Jean de Goutte, commanding the 21 Corps, which included the Marines, issued orders that the 4th Marine Brigade would henceforth march at the head of French formations, a position of honor usually reserved for French units with the longest combat records. The French Croix de Guerre was awarded not to individuals, but to the entire brigade, its members authorized to wear the fourragère, a braided cord in French colors, on their uniforms forever after. General Pershing visited the battlefield on the 28th of June, walking through Belleau Wood with Major General Harbord. The American Expeditionary Forces commander, known for his stern demeanor and reluctance to praise, reportedly stood in silence for several minutes observing the devastation and the exhausted Marines, preparing to move to rear areas for rest. When he finally spoke, his words were simple but profound. The deadliest weapon in the world is a Marine and his rifle. This phrase, perhaps apocryphal but widely reported in subsequent accounts, captured the essence of what had occurred in this French forest. The propaganda value of Belleau Wood's capture resonated far beyond the battlefield. American newspapers, which had questioned whether their nation's military could match European armies hardened by 4 years of war, trumpeted the victory in bold headlines. The New York Times declared Marines win in bloodiest fighting yet, while the Chicago Tribune proclaimed Devil Dogs defeat Kaiser's best. These accounts, often exaggerated and sanitized of combat's true horror, nevertheless served a crucial purpose, convincing the American public and Allied partners that the United States military had arrived as a force capable of defeating Germany. For the Marines who survived, Belleau Wood became the defining experience of their lives. In decades to come, men would mark time as before or after the wood. The battle forged traditions and identity that would shape the Marine Corps through subsequent conflicts. The insistence on aggressive offense, the refusal to accept defeat or retreat, the belief in the individual Marine superiority over any opponent, these characteristics, often criticized by military professionals as reckless or outdated, had proven devastatingly effective in France's forests. Belleau Wood validated the Marine Corps' existence at a moment when some in the military establishment questioned the need for a separate naval infantry force. The summer of 1918 continued with Allied offensives that would eventually break German resistance and end the Great War. But for the Marines who fought at Belleau Wood, no subsequent battle could match that forest's intensity. They moved to rest areas behind the lines where they slept for days, waking with nightmares that would persist for decades. Hospital trains carried the wounded to base hospitals in Paris and coastal ports, where surgeons worked miracles saving men who would have died in earlier wars. Though many survivors faced lives forever altered by missing limbs, scarred lungs from gas attacks, or psychological wounds that 1918 medicine could neither understand nor treat, the awards and decorations began arriving in July. The Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration, went to 5 Marines for actions at Belleau Wood: Gunnery Sergeant Ernest Jansen, Sergeant Mate Kokak, Corporal John Kelly, Private First Class Henry Hulbert, and Gunnery Sergeant Fred Stockham, the latter posthumously as he had died from the effects of gas poisoning after giving his mask to a wounded comrade. The Navy Cross, second only to the Medal of Honor, was awarded to dozens more, including Lieutenant Clifton Cates, Captain Lloyd Williams, and scores of Marines whose names would become legend within the Corps. The German Army, though defeated at Belleau Wood, learned crucial lessons from the battle. American fighting spirit and individual initiative at the squad and platoon level exceeded expectations, forcing German planners to revise assessments that had dismissed United States forces as negligible. The nickname Devil Dogs spread through German units, carrying with it a grudging respect and genuine fear. German intelligence reports from July 1918 specifically warned commanders to expect fierce resistance when facing Marine units, advice that would prove prescient in subsequent battles at Soissons and the Meuse-Argonne. French civilians returned to their shattered villages in the weeks following the battle, finding landscapes transformed by war. Madame Tuillier, the elderly woman who had sheltered Marines in Buresh, discovered her home reduced to rubble, but alive with flowers left by grateful leathernecks who remembered her courage. The mayor of Belleau village, whose population had fled during the fighting, returned to find Marine graves carefully tended in the village cemetery, each marked with a wooden cross and the dead man's name and unit. This attention to honoring the fallen moved French communities deeply, beginning a relationship between Belleau Wood's villages and the United States Marine Corps that continues to the present day. The casualty lists published in American newspapers through July and August 1918 brought the war home to communities across the nation. Gold stars appeared in windows from Maine to California, each representing a son, brother, or father who would not return. The tiny town of Heber City, Utah, population barely 2,000, lost 4 Marines at Belleau Wood, an entire generation of young men from one small community, erased in 3 weeks of fighting. These losses were replicated in countless American towns, the cost of victory measured in empty chairs at dinner tables and futures that would never be realized. Historians debate Belleau Wood's strategic significance, with some arguing it was a relatively minor engagement inflated by propaganda needs and Marine Corps mythology. The forest's capture, they note, did not fundamentally alter the war's trajectory or shorten its duration. The German offensive had already stalled when the Marines attacked, making Belleau Wood's defense less critical than contemporary accounts suggested. These analyses, while technically accurate, miss the battle's true importance. Belleau Wood demonstrated American military capability at a crucial psychological moment, convincing Allied leaders that the United States could contribute meaningfully to victory and shocking German commanders who had expected minimal resistance from inexperienced American forces. The United States Marine Corps emerged from Belleau Wood transformed. Before 1918, Marines were primarily naval infantry, shipboard guards, and constabulary forces in American colonial possessions. After Belleau Wood, they were elite assault infantry, shock troops comparable to any in the world. This identity, forged in a French forest, would shape the Corps through subsequent conflicts in the Pacific War, Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. Every Marine recruit to this day learns the story of Belleau Wood during training, internalizing lessons about courage, tenacity, and the refusal to accept defeat that those June days exemplified. By November 1918, when the armistice finally silenced the guns across Europe, the Marines who survived Belleau Wood had fought in additional battles: Soissons, Saint-Mihiel, Blanquemont, the Meuse-Argonne. Each engagement added to the casualty lists and the Corps' growing reputation. Yet veterans of these later battles invariably spoke of Belleau Wood as different, more intense, more primal than what followed. Perhaps it was the forest itself, the claustrophobic chaos of combat amid the trees. Perhaps it was simply that Belleau Wood was their first real battle, and nothing afterward could match that initial immersion in warfare's horror and glory. The final accounting of Belleau Wood's cost continued for years. Men who survived the battle died from wounds or gas exposure in 1919 and 1920. Others lived decades carrying steel fragments in their bodies, their health gradually undermined by injuries sustained in that French forest. The psychological casualties, men we would now recognize as suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, often went unrecorded. They simply disappeared into American society, Their struggles with nightmares, depression, and survivor's guilt invisible to a nation eager to forget war's reality and embrace peace's promise. Belleau Wood today remains a memorial to those who fought there. The American Battle Monuments Commission maintains a cemetery nearby where many of the American dead rest in ordered ranks beneath white crosses and stars of David. The forest itself, replanted after the war's devastation, has grown back, though visitors report finding rusted helmets, corroded ammunition, and bone fragments even a century later. French schoolchildren learn the story of the American Marines who saved their grandparents' generation, keeping alive a gratitude that transcends the decades. Each June, ceremonies commemorate the battle, attended by aging veterans in the early years, then their children and grandchildren, now their great and great-great-grandchildren, ensuring that the sacrifice is never forgotten. The lessons of Belleau Wood extended far beyond the Marine Corps. American military doctrine absorbed insights about the importance of small unit leadership, the necessity of combined arms coordination between infantry and artillery, and the psychological dimensions of modern warfare. The battle demonstrated that courage alone, while essential, was insufficient. Tactical flexibility, logistical support, and realistic training were equally critical. Future Marine leaders, many of whom had served as junior officers or enlisted men at Belleau Wood, carried these lessons into the Pacific campaigns of the 1940s, where island assaults would echo the forest fighting of 1918. The German perspective on Belleau Wood, less documented but equally important, revealed an army surprised by American effectiveness. German intelligence had predicted that United States forces, lacking combat experience, would require months of frontline exposure before becoming competent fighters. Belleau Wood shattered this assessment in 3 weeks of brutal combat. The psychological impact on German morale, already strained by 4 years of war and the failure of the spring offensive, cannot be overstated. If fresh American divisions could fight with such ferocity, what hope remained for German victory as hundreds of thousands more Americans arrived in France each month? The Marine Corps Birthday Ball, celebrated annually on the 10th of November by Marines worldwide, always includes reference to Belleau Wood. The traditional ceremony features reading of Commandant John Lejeune's 1921 birthday message, which specifically mentions the battle. The performance of duty of the officers and enlisted men of this regiment has been such as to merit, not praise, for praise is superfluous. They have been Marines. This understated acknowledgement, so characteristic of military culture, carries profound meaning for those who understand what transpired in that forest. To have been a Marine at Belleau Wood was to have participated in the Corps' defining moment. The artistic and literary legacy of Belleau Wood emerged in the decades following the war. Captain John Thomason's illustrated memoir, Fix Bayonets, published in 1926, brought the battle to life for civilian readers with prose that captured both the horror and strange beauty of combat. His descriptions of wheat fields at dawn, machine gun fire like typewriters from hell, and Marines advancing with bayonets fixed became canonical texts, shaping how subsequent generations understood the battle. Other veterans wrote their own accounts, though many found that words failed to convey the full reality of those June days. Hollywood discovered Belleau Wood in the 1920s and 30s, producing films that romanticized the battle while sanitizing its brutality. These movies, with their clean-faced actors playing heroic Marines, bore little resemblance to the muddy, terrified yet determined men who actually fought in the forest. Veterans often expressed frustration at these portrayals, feeling that cinema's glamorization dishonored those who died by making their sacrifice seem glorious rather than tragic. Yet these films served a purpose, keeping the battle in public consciousness and inspiring future generations to serve. The international implications of Belleau Wood resonated through the interwar period. France's gratitude toward the United States, demonstrated through memorials and continued commemoration, created diplomatic bonds that would prove crucial when Europe again descended into war in 1939. The reputation American forces earned at Belleau Wood as fierce, reliable allies willing to sustain heavy casualties for shared objectives influenced Allied strategic planning in World War II. When American troops again landed in France in 1944, they carried with them the legacy of Belleau Wood, a standard of courage and effectiveness their fathers and uncles had established a generation earlier. For the United States Marine Corps specifically, Belleau Wood became sacred ground in ways that transcended military significance. The battle validated the Corps' existence during a period when budget constraints and inter-service rivalry threatened its survival. Arguments that the Marines were redundant, that the Army could perform all necessary infantry missions, withered in the face of what had been accomplished in France. Belleau Wood gave the Marine Corps a unique identity and historical narrative that justified its continued existence as a separate service, an institutional survival that would prove critical in subsequent conflicts. The medical advances spurred by treating Belleau Wood's casualties influenced civilian medicine for decades. The concentration of wounds in such a short period forced innovation in triage, surgical techniques for removing shrapnel, and treatment of gas exposure. Military doctors who served in field hospitals near Belleau Wood returned to civilian practice bringing these skills, improving trauma care across America. The psychological casualties, though poorly understood at the time, prompted early research into what would eventually be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, laying groundwork for modern military psychiatry. The families of those who died at Belleau Wood carried their grief through the 20th century and beyond. Gold Star mothers made pilgrimages to France in the 1920s and 30s, visiting graves and seeking closure that often proved elusive. These women who had lost sons to a war fought in a foreign land for abstract principles of democracy and Allied solidarity represented millions of American families touched by the Great War's tragedy. Their stories, less documented than those of the warriors, were equally important. The home front's sacrifice measured not in casualties, but in permanent absence, in potential never realized, in families incomplete. By the 21st century, the last veterans of Belleau Wood had passed into history, taking with them the direct memories of those June days in 1918. What remained was institutional memory, carefully preserved by the Marine Corps and commemorated in France but inevitably altered by time's passage. The young men who fought in that forest became historical figures, their letters and diaries primary sources for scholars, their photographs artifacts in museums. Yet their legacy endures in every Marine who learns the story, absorbs its lessons, and carries forward the tradition of courage and tenacity that Belleau Wood exemplified. The strategic lessons of Belleau Wood, about the costs of frontal assault, the importance of artillery support, the value of forest combat training, the necessity of clear command and control in complex terrain, were studied in military academies worldwide. Some lessons were learned, others forgotten and relearned at terrible cost in subsequent wars. The fundamental truth that emerged from Belleau Wood, however, transcended tactical details. That determined infantry, well led and properly supported, could overcome prepared defenses through sheer will and sacrifice. This lesson, though purchased at horrific cost, validated the enduring importance of the individual soldier or Marine in an age of industrial warfare. The battle's impact on French-American relations deserves final mention. The villages around Belleau Wood, Lucy-le-Bocage, Bourèche, Belleau itself, maintained ties with the United States Marine Corps across generations. Schools were named for American units, streets for fallen Marines. French children laid flowers on American graves long after the war ended, a tradition passed from grandparents to parents to children. When Marines returned to France in future conflicts or peacetime visits, they found themselves welcomed with a warmth and gratitude that stemmed directly from Belleau Wood. This relationship, built on shared sacrifice and mutual respect, became one of the Great War's most enduring legacies. The final words belong to those who were there. Captain Lloyd Williams, who proclaimed, "We just got here at the battle's start," survived the war but died in 1919 during the influenza pandemic, his lungs weakened by gas exposure at Belleau Wood. First Sergeant Daniel Daly lived until 1937, carrying 3 Medal of Honor citations and memories that haunted him until death. Lieutenant Clifton Cates rose to become Commandant of the Marine Corps, serving from 1948 to 1952, always identifying himself first and foremost as a Marine who had fought at Belleau Wood. Their generation, the men who transformed a French hunting forest into hallowed ground for the United States Marine Corps, left an inheritance of courage that continues inspiring those who follow. Belleau Wood stands in history as testament to human capacity for both terrible violence and extraordinary courage. In 20 days of savage fighting, young men from American farms and cities proved themselves equal to any soldiers in the world, earning respect from allies and enemies alike. They paid a price measured in thousands of casualties, in lives cut short, in futures erased. Yet their sacrifice was not meaningless. They stopped a German offensive, demonstrated American resolve, and forged a military tradition that endures. When Marines speak of Belleau Wood today, they speak not just of a battle won but of an identity forged, a standard set, a promise made to those who fell that their sacrifice would never be forgotten and their example never dishonored. That promise, kept across generations, may be Belleau Wood's most important legacy of all.